So good afternoon, everyone. I'm here in Geneva, delighted to be with two of the three panelists, at least. One is maybe stuck in the wires, Michael Roberts, Paolo Gazati, and we will soon have with us Dwayne Layton. So that's the Geneva panel. And we have a very sort of deeply involved experts that will talk about reform and the future of multilateralism. The first speaker is Michael Roberts, one of my colleagues, an outstanding man who's full of ideas and creativity, and he'll talk about some of these ideas he has. Michael is the one who sort of invented the idea of a special WTO group dealing with COVID and trade measures. And he's also the one who last year worked a lot on disasters and trade and more. So Michael, why don't you simply start, and I may come afterwards with further information about you and your proposals.
Okay, thanks very much, Gabrielle, for that introduction. I've got a short PowerPoint that I wanted to show, which of course now I don't see on my screen. Let's give it a try.
Yes, we see.
Sharing, so I'm seeing Zoom, but that doesn't, of course, show you. Let's see. Now, can you see multilateralism? Can you see a PowerPoint?
Yes,
okay,
very good.
Excellent. Right, now, so obviously one of the hazards of using PowerPoint in this kinds of things is time management. So please, Gabrielle, do feel free to push me along. I think this presentation is perhaps best depicted by the picture on the right, which is black swans. So black swan events, this is what we're talking about. Now, to try and find a black swan that wasn't covered by intellectual property, I had to go across the road and take a photo of one. So we probably all know where the black swans are. Being able to use them or understand them is perhaps the challenge. So I'm going to very quickly in the 10 minutes or so that remain to run you through the work that Gabrielle introduced on natural disasters, talk about the impact of COVID, and then think about this in the context of multilateral action WTO functions. So obviously that's a huge amount of territory to cover within the time that I have, but let's give it a shot. So let's just try and how have natural disasters been picked up in the context of WTO? Well, one area that we pick them up is through the peer review mechanism, which we call the trade policy review. So if you take the 172 trade policy reviews that go back to 2010, 31% of those refer to a natural disaster. Now, those of you, many of you might have an idea as to what the most common natural disaster one is. Oddly enough, it's actually drought. And we'll talk about the impact of drought in the context of Paraguay's economic performance. But you can see that clearly this is something which is being picked up within WTO peer review mechanisms as having an impact on trade. So you can start to see it there. So of course, not all natural disasters are the same. So if you look at the slide on the left, the top line, the blue one, is hydrometeorological events. So this talks about things like droughts, cyclones, etc. And the red line is geophysical events. So here, earthquakes, volcanoes, etc. And you can see that the bottom line is pretty stable. The top line is growing, and one can surmise or project that this is perhaps something related to climate change. Now, of course, all of these different disasters, typically local in their impact, but they may also have spillovers. So the eruption of the volcano that even 10 years later nobody can pronounce, the Icelandic volcano, that grounded most aviation in northern Europe. So you can see that one particular event can have a have a magnified impact on the global economy, depending on where it takes place. So here on the right, I would just ask you to spare a thought for Vanuatu, which was hit by a Category 5 tropical cyclone just as the world went into lockdown, which obviously complicated tremendously the job of delivering humanitarian assistance. Now, what does this mean in terms of economic planning and trade? So let's look at this red line here. This is Paraguay's economic performance going back to 2004. What you see is almost like this heartbeat in 2008, 2009. That's the global economic crisis. 2010 to 2012 is a drought. And you see economic recovery. And then what you see again from 2017 onwards is another drought, compounded by the impact then of COVID. So this is really sort of an example of what life is like being on an economist's yo-yo. It's extremely hard for economic planning. And that segues into the next slide. And before I just go into that, one of the impacts of COVID is this requirement that many countries have for emergency financing because of balance of payments issues. So that's up to 102 countries now.
Can I interrupt you? Can I interrupt, Michael?
Sure.
Can you just, for us to understand the link between this work that you did on disaster and reform, what brought you to all this research about trade and disaster, and how is it linked to reforms?
Okay, if you allow me, Gabrielle, let me maybe develop that in the second half of the presentation. So
very well.
This is where we start to get into the topics that you were talking about. So let's get back to the dark days of March and look at that projection on the top right hand side. So you see there are three lines. You see the impact in terms of trade. So the optimistic scenario was a decline of 13%. The pessimistic scenario was a decline of 32%. Essentially, what you had was three processes going on at the same time. You had a demand impact, as much as everybody was after the same goods. So what are we talking about in terms of those goods? We're talking about things like face masks, etc. You had a supply effect. So the manufacturers, they had to repurpose their systems to deal with the impact of COVID restrictions, sanitary restrictions. And then we had a transport effect, which was grounding flights, which was stopping planes and trucks and trains from getting to their destination. Now, the impact of everyone running after the same group of products like face masks was that you had export prohibitions and restrictions getting in place. And so 85 countries took those measures. And there wasn't any one particular measure that was being taken. It was across a range of different things. Then, of course, as supply started to become available, you went from a situation of red tape to red carpet. So from the red tape, i.e. in terms of export controls, you then had trade facilitation measures being taken to try and facilitate the access to those goods that were previously in deficit. So that's the trajectory. I'll skip this slide in the interest of time, but maybe we can come back and look at that. So then what does this mean for a kind of a reform agenda? So this really looks at here, what is the role of the multilateral trading system in all of this? So here are some ideas. In the under function, you'll see there 5 of the 6 functions of the WTO, and then together with some examples. So administering trade agreements. So here you can see that there were notifications that were made under different trade agreements of COVID-related measures. There was a very detailed discussion that took place at the General Council, which is obviously the overarching trade body at WTO, and then detailed discussions in each one of the separate committees. a number of committees rather, acting as a forum for negotiations. Well, the trade facilitation agreement wasn't negotiated with COVID or with the delivery of humanitarian supplies in mind, but it obviously has a lot of provisions which are extremely relevant to it, as does GATT, as does the Plurilateral Pharmaceuticals Agreement, as do other agreements. TRIPS is obviously a case in mind. And you can see that there have been decisions that have been reached in the past with respect to public health crises. So the decision on TRIPS and public health, going back to 2001, is one that's related for for the AIDS pandemic at the time. And then you have bilateral measures that require WTO waivers. So there, the US trade preferences in the aftermath of the Nepalese earthquake could also have referenced the EU trade preferences for Pakistan. So there's a number of different approaches. There's a rules approach, and then there's sort of a more tailored approaches. And then there's this function that WTO has in terms of trade monitoring. So there, obviously, we feed into the G20 processes, and we've already mentioned the trade policy reviews. Then just going down to the bottom, and this then speaks to obviously the DG selection process. The DG has an important role there to play in terms also of the ability to discuss with with her peers, as it's going to be a her, in terms of these joint statements that were issued. Now, the discussion at the General Council in May, you'll see there's a huge number of issues that were raised there. I don't propose to go through all of those. It gives you an idea of the different directions that discussions have gone in. But just to say that it hasn't really coalesced around any one specific issue. It's probably focusing in on a number of them. So let's try and look at bringing this to a close as a way of sort of introducing these issues. I think that there are sort of three main approaches there, Gabrielle, to thinking about how we deal with this growing sort of kind of caseload of disasters, with obviously hydrometeorological ones being the ones that are growing the most. And that's sort of a systems approach. So they're taking the approach that the G20 took in their comments, which was to say, it's important the markets remain open. It's important that we refrain from protectionist measures. And so there, one particular comment they made, recommendation they made, was that emergency measures, so those export controls, must be targeted, proportionate, transparent, and temporary. So that's kind of looking at the system as a whole. And then within each agreement, there are particular rules that will be applicable or useful in any one particular situation. So there, if we think about obviously trade facilitation, intellectual property, etc., projecting that ahead, there are discussions there thinking about, well, how do we take the impact of COVID into the agriculture discussions? How do we think about potentially updating the pharmaceuticals agreement, or looking at a broader set of disciplines on medical goods? How do we take it into e-commerce? What does it mean for transparency, exceptions, etc.? And then finally, exceptions. So there, where do we need to tinker with the system to adapt it to a particular situation? And here, obviously, there's quite a large focus now on the issue of intellectual property, and you can expect that there will be further discussions there, potentially on waivers for bilateral situations. And as we know, special and differential treatment is an ongoing issue. So
Michael, I think, I think you have maybe 30 seconds to wrap up.
Okay, so 30 seconds, there we are. So let me just look at these two images. For the natural disasters work, one of the statements that we had was by the then IFRC Secretary General. His basic point was, we know that natural disasters, we know that shocks and hazards are there. Whether they turn into disasters really depends on how we plan for them, how we react to them, and how we are resilient towards them. But that obviously depends, that involves some trade-offs. So hence the cartoon taken from the Daily Telegraph and Matt, which shows a couple looking out of their plane window at a hurricane, saying, well, that's one of the trees that we planted to offset the carbon emissions from the flood. So with that, that's a sprint through those issues, but hopefully it will be a good
Thank you,
basis for
Michael.
discussion.
So crisis can have good effects, triggering reforms that are necessary or desired. I'm also, thank you very much, Michael. I'm pleased that Dwayne has joined us. And now we'll go to Paolo Gazati, who is now the head of the unit in charge of relations with Latin America in DG Trade, including Mercosur. But Paolo was for years in Geneva, dealing, of course, with WTO matter. Paolo, share with us your views on reform, what can be done, and what we can learn from the EU perspective. Thank you.
Now I'm unmuted. Thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you very much. And it's nice to be back in a Geneva environment to discuss about multilateral issues. As you have indicated in your introduction, I don't really fit here any longer. I'm not in Geneva any longer. I'm in charge of a bilateral agenda now in the Commission. And while I studied law at university, I won't really dare to call myself a lawyer. Still, I could not resist the intellectual pleasure of sitting on a panel with old colleagues like you, Michael, and friends, and I remain fully committed to this agenda, even I'm working now to promote it in a different role. What I say, of course, are not the views and opinion of the European Union and are just mine and not the position of the EU. You, Gabrielle, you chose the title and the bridge metaphor, and I'm not sure I would totally espouse this definition, if you allow me. So I don't think necessarily that the EU should pursue a bridging role between China and the US as an objective of its trade policy and of the reform of the WTO. I think the EU should walk its autonomous path, which does not necessarily always mean equidistance in all instances. And this is particularly the case for the 2 points I will wish to focus today in my short presentation, the level playing field and the rule of law. Multilateralism is in the DNA of Europe. The EU, because of its very nature, is suited to thrive in a rule-based international environment. The defense of multilateralism is therefore one of our strategic objectives, not just in terms of trade policy, but more broadly. Actually, I could say that the EU can be seen as an open multilateral construction, if you allow me this Francisism, this French term, and is based mainly on 2 elements, the internal market, and I would underline particularly the role that the state aids and competition dimension plays in it, and the rule of law. Our new Commissioner for Trade went recently in front of the European Parliament, and he has indicated what the EU is thinking in terms of WTO reform. The underlying idea, and I know that it might sound Eurocentric, is that the EU wishes to project externally what he has achieved with his single market, and be sure, and we are sure that at least in DigiTrade, we also try to make sure that our colleagues take due into account multilateral rules when they establish our own internal market rules. I believe that by promoting the EU multilateral agenda policy, the EU will not only contribute to our political objectives, but will always also benefit the multilateral trading system more broadly. I would wish to come to some of these ideas that the Commissioner put forward and then focus, as I say, on a couple of them. First of all, and linking back to what Michael was saying, to face the challenge of the pandemic, the EU will push forward initiatives on trade and health to ensure that trade in medicinal products can flow freely and enhance the resilience of global value chains for health products and medicines. So that is one response. On the SDG, of course, we have the fishery subsidies negotiation. And but the EU will explore as well with interested parties a plurilateral trade and climate initiative focused on the liberalization of goods and services contributing to climate change mitigation. We think about combining the elimination of tariffs on products supporting climate action by as many WTO members as possible, and envisage as well reforming and reinforcing the monitoring role of the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment on climate-related measures. And generally as well to support this with a strengthened climate focus on trade-related technical assistance. Shortly now, of course, as I said, and I will expand more on this later, we think that a key element of the WTO reform agenda is to address the inadequacy of the current rules on level playing field. We need to rein in distortive subsidies, ensure that state-owned enterprises operate under free market conditions, and prohibit forced technology transfers. Of course, we will continue to engage on e-commerce. We will, and on the institutional side, as I referred to plurilateral initiatives, e-commerce and our ideas on health and climate in this category. We do need to address the need to update the WTO institutional framework by defining mechanisms to incorporate plurilateral agreements within the WTO. Which is critical, I think, in an organization of that dimension. Special and differential treatment, of course, flexibilities and support are available, but should be adapted to those countries that actually need them. And then last but not least, and I see there's a lot of attention, and I will come back to this in the second part of my presentation, we need to have a meaningful reform of the WTO dispute settlement system to restore a binding two-tier review by independent adjudicators. So I'll go back to two elements of this agenda.
Yes, you have 3 minutes, Paolo.
I should make it. I should make it. I would wish to. So one.
Quite an ambitious agenda of reform from EU, but 3 minutes, please.
Yes. So the rule of law and the level playing field. I've seen all the emails that I've received from the organizer, which I thanks. We've had this nice rule of law, one of the greatest unifying factor, and the keynote speech that we had today as well referred to that. The rule of law is challenged on many fronts in the WTO. And the previous panel have already debated extensively on this point. And I spent long hours actually around some excellent wine with Daniel discussing these matters in Geneva. On one side, you have the US seem to consider that the judicial element of the WTO architecture has gone too far, and that the rule of law at international level can't work if there's not sufficiently solid political consensus among countries that sustain it. A fundamental criticism they make is that consensus has disappeared as some members are reneged on some fundamental principles, and notably market-driven economy and rule of law. In this conversation I had in Geneva, people were asking, how can you have a supranational system based on the rule of law if in certain members the rule of law doesn't apply because it's not, doesn't prime? Can you have the rule of law applying on issues where the rules are not good enough and create an excessive pressure on your internal system? My view is that if we don't find a way to reply somehow yes, maybe even a conditional yes to these questions, we risk undoing what we have been building for the last 7 years in the WTO. Some colleagues from other WTO members would say, no, either you frame and contain the role of the state and you have a constitutional system where a Supreme Court cannot be challenged by political decision, or you don't belong here. I think multilateralism itself is about building bridges, even between different economic and political models. And we need to and can find a way to this new equilibrium. On the rule of law, it is clear. The current situation, in my view, is untenable. We need to find a solution, as I say before, with meaningful reform to restore the two-tier system by independent adjudication. The MPAA is like comparable to the virus today, is an intensive care unit, but we need the vaccine and a new appellate body in place to challenge that, to solve that problem. And I want to expand more on this given the time constraints. As to the level playing field, after the Euro round, we have made an important step. There was a different approach to the role of the state in the EU and the US economy, and we addressed it and sorted out with the ASM and the agreement on agriculture. we need to go back to the negotiating table and find new rules on distorting subsidies and the role of state-owned enterprises. Some ask what would be the leverage to move ahead with this negotiation on the level playing field. And I confess I don't have the silver bullet, but the alternative would be that the most powerful trading nation, and include the EU, will find ways to defend their interests, and those with less bargaining power will pay the price of a worsening trading environment across the board. Maybe some middle grounders, the Ottawa Group, for example, in Geneva, should coalesce in promoting this endeavor. There were ideas of a big case to bring this into a dispute. But more generally, I think WTO members need to understand that what creates distortion and imbalances abroad reinforces also the internal structural problems that they have internally and leads to unsteady, unbalanced, uncoordinated, and unsustainable development. Just a few things to show how
Paolo, 30 seconds maybe, because we'll come back with questions.
Okay.
And then we'll go to Dwayne.
Then in the questions, I might touch upon what we have been doing in the European Union to move ahead this agenda, and to how do we deploy our policy on open strategic autonomy. That is probably what will dictate the EU way in future years. Thank you.
This is maybe where the word bridge takes place, but quite an ambitious.
If a bridge emerges from all of this, we are perfectly fine with that. Is in our genes.
Quite an ambitious reform program. Thank you, Paolo. So Dwayne is with us, and it's an important speaker, but also an important participant. He's well known. Of course, I know him well. He's done disputes and all sorts of things. He's the head of the trade practice at Mayors Brown, and they are the sponsors of this conference. So clearly, they are friends and love of WTO. So Dwayne, what could you suggest in terms of reform? How do you see the situation after Michael spoke about the fact that crisis, disasters, and pandemic will and is leading to changes? Paolo talked about the push and the agenda of the EU. What are your personal views as a WTO expert and practitioner?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I agree with a lot of things I've heard. I'm getting old at this point, in my mid 60s, and with that comes a certain amount of skepticism. But I'm also a glass half full kind of guy. And as you say, I love the WTO. I think it plays an important role in this world. So let me give you a few comments, and I want to stress that these comments today are my own. They should not be attributed to my law firm or any client. I also want to make clear that, while I'm an American, I'm not here to defend U.S. trade policy, including its approach to the WTO. As I said, I have one purpose today: to speak plainly about the future of the WTO. But first, just a quick look back. Did you know, and you probably do, that world trade volumes today are roughly, I think, about 41 times the level recorded in the early days of the GATT? And I believe this growth in trade and trade liberalization has lifted millions of people around the world out of poverty. And I believe the WTO and the GATT before it can and should take a great deal of credit for these gains. Unfortunately, the role that the WTO plays in the global economy is at risk of being sidelined. And if that happens, millions of people, especially in the developing world, will suffer. We'll go from a rules-based trading system to a might makes right system. So as everybody in this conference, and certainly this panel knows, the WTO has essentially three functions. One, oversee compliance with existing rules through various means, including notification of measures pursuant to certain covered agreements, including the SCM and TBT agreements, help organize and support international trade negotiations, hopefully leading to new and improved rules, and of course, dispute settlement. And I would argue that all three functions are broken and in need of major repair, or as DDG Wolf recently put it, quote, a conservative form of revolution. The compliance function is for the most part a joke. Members are largely ignoring their notification obligations for things like subsidies and technical regulations. The negotiation function is at best comatose. After 7, some would say 14 painful years, the Doha round was put out of its misery, and we basically see nothing with the exception of TFA and ITA since. And finally, the crown jewel of the WTO dispute settlement. Yes, panels continue their work, albeit at reduced levels, but the major contribution of the Uruguay round agreements in general, and the DSU in particular, was to go from a positive consensus dispute settlement system to a negative one. That is essentially gone. With the AB closed for business, a losing member can simply appeal into the void, as we put it, robbing the panel report of any legal effect. I read an article recently where a reporter declared, quote, the WTO is in crisis because the US is blocking the appointment of judges in the WTO's highest court. Well, I wish things were that simple because I think the AB can be fixed. It won't be easy, but I'm quite confident that it can and will offer, and I will offer a few suggestions in that regard to the extent time permits. Look, the biggest issue faced by the WTO, and Paolo mentioned it, the level playing field, I'll state it plainly, it is China. When China joined the WTO in 2001, it was the 6th largest economy in the world. Today, it's the 2nd, and many believe by 2024, it'll be the largest. One of my partners at Mayor Brown is Ambassador Mickey Cantor. Another is Ambassador Susan Schwab. Mickey was President Clinton's USTR, and Susan was USTR under Bush 43. I'm sure many of you have seen the photograph of the US signing its papers to join the WTO. Holding the pen was Mickey Cantor. I mention them because we have discussed US expectations when China joined the WTO. They and others thought China would over time adhere to its WTO obligations. Over time, most people thought China would reform its economy and deploy capital based on market-oriented principles. Well, that simply has not happened. China's chosen a state-dominated economic model, which does not follow the implicit assumptions underlying the WTO rules. Earlier this month, Brazil, Japan, and the US issued a joint statement that expressed, quote, serious concerns with non-market-oriented policies and practices that have resulted in damage to the world trading system and led to such things as severe overcapacity, uncompetitive conditions, hindered the development and use of innovative technologies, et cetera, et cetera. Well, please understand, I don't say these things to criticize China. China has, I represent China. China has every right to choose whatever form of government and economy it wants. But having made that choice, China needs to accept its consequences. China can work with members to develop what some have called a new, quote, interface or, quote, bridging mechanism. And Paolo and others may be skeptical of that, but if it doesn't, I believe China will effectively be kicked out of the WTO. We see, in my opinion, we see the beginnings of this already with the punitive tariffs imposed by the US on a vast array of Chinese goods pursuant to Section 301, and the de facto ban on China's 5G technology. And I suppose the NME methodology applied to China in trade remedy cases. Now, those of us who value the WTO and its role in the global trading system have to ask ourselves, how do we avoid this death spiral? And let's be clear, this won't happen quickly. It'll happen over many years, during which time the dispute settlement system will likely remain crippled, and a new round of trade negotiations, one that has a chance of tackling important issues like e-commerce and sustainability, will remain a distant dream. And it will also be messy, forcing members like Japan and Korea to choose sides in a trade war no one will win. As Paolo noted, the EU's Trade Commissioner revealed last month that the Commission is working on a proposal to reform the WTO. Apparently, the Commission plans to reveal their proposal. I think it's been dubbed open strategic autonomy, close quote, early next year. And perhaps, God willing, this proposal will bring members of the WTO, especially the US and the EU, together and set them on a course to achieving meaningful reforms. But again, I'm an old man and I'm kind of skeptical. Now, part of my skepticism stems from the effects of national rivalries and partisan politics within certain member countries. Look what, now from my American perspective, look what happened when the EU rolled out its proposal to reform the WTO in AB, the appellate body, in 2018. That thing was dead on arrival in Washington. Why? Well, several reasons, not the least of which, because China was one of the principal co-sponsors. China, really? Now, look, I believe the private sector should assert itself. If we sit around waiting for our governments to get this done, we may be waiting a long time. The private sector should come forward and propose a comprehensive set of reforms that is presented to the WTO membership or perhaps a subgroup of sponsors. It could do so through a lawyers committee. The committee would be tasked with proposing clear and comprehensive reforms designed to rehabilitate all three functions of the WTO. Reforms that also address the so-called China problem. A non-governmental organization with a history of supporting causes on a bipartisan basis could fund the effort. Look, solutions to many of these issues are not hard to imagine. For example, on compliance and monitoring, the system needs to be strengthened with sanctions imposed for deficient notifications and positive incentives for compliance. A stronger and more effective compliance and monitoring function would ease some of the strain and burden on the dispute settlement system. Speaking of the DS system, I believe we need to reimagine the system. For one thing, let's put trade remedies in its own system, or at the very least ensure that every AB panel hearing an appeal from the Rules Division has at least one member, preferably two, with trade remedy experience. It's an arcane area of the law. It constitutes the majority of all DS cases, and I would argue it was intended to be treated differently than all other disputes. No other covered agreement, to my knowledge, contains language like that found in Article 17.6 of the AD agreement. The clear purpose of that language, which was insisted upon by the United States, was to force WTO panels to defer to the reasonable factual determinations of investigating authorities around the world, including the US DOC and International Trade Commission. Many in Washington believe that has not happened. As for the crisis surrounding the appellate body, I don't have time to list all the issues and all the proposals floating around out there. But what I will say is this: I believe, as I heard Paolo say, that a rules-based trading system is well served by a two-tier dispute settlement system. For any of you who have been involved in a GATT or WTO dispute, you know the factual and legal issues often under consideration can be complex and many. Ad hoc panels composed of trade lawyers and other experts can make mistakes. The role of the AB should be to catch those mistakes and set things straight. However, the role of the AB cannot be to relitigate the facts, including the meaning of municipal or domestic law. The jurisprudence and practice surrounding Article 11 of the DSU has gone off the rails. Based on the holdings in EC meat hormones and other cases, appellants now routinely seek to relitigate all sorts of factual questions before the AB under the guise that the panel has failed to make, quote, an objective assessment of the facts, close quote. If we fix this one problem, we will do much to fix a host of other problems, like AB workloads, number of appeals, time to decide appeals, and we will even improve the quality of panel reports. How? Because right now, and I can say this based on personal experience and confession, some members often would rather save factual issues for appeal rather than provide clarifications and corrections to the panel during the interim review stage. And there are many more things we should be able to agree on to help reform the WTO in general. And the
Dwayne, can I please ask you 1 minute to conclude?
Yes, absolutely.
So that everybody can comment on your great proposals.
Absolutely. So time limits on opening statements, and of course the sequencing issue between 21.5 and 22.6. Look, in terms of negotiations, I just think it's a waste of time to be talking about a new round unless and until we solve the so-called China problem. The United States is not going to spend the domestic political capital to launch a new round unless and until we address China's industrial subsidies, lack of adequate IP protections, and distortions caused by SEOs, just to name a few. Now, some of you may think this, sounds naive. Who thinks China's going to change its stripes? Well, I'm not asking China to do so. It just has to agree to change the terms upon which it is a member of the WTO. Because if it does not, it will slowly but inevitably be forced out of the WTO on a de facto basis. In closing, no one should think for a second that if Donald Trump gets voted out of office next month, all these issues will suddenly go away and the WTO will be back in business. Criticism of the WTO, especially the DS system, started in Washington on both sides of the political aisle well before Donald Trump. He and his administration just tore the scab off the wound. And I would say the same thing about China. For the foreseeable future, no politician in the United States, including Joe Biden, wants to be perceived as soft on China. That's not to say a Biden administration will look and feel the same as the Trump administration. I think it will, you can safely assume a Biden administration will not be so keen to poke an eye in the eye of our allies on trade and defense. I would also expect a Biden administration to strike a different tone in Geneva. But if you think, as I do, that the WTO faces systemic issues that need to be resolved, I would expect a Biden administration to use US willingness to engage on the AB as leverage to achieve meaningful reform of the WTO rules. Thanks. Quite happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dwayne. Here is what I suggest. We have already 2 questions. I'll mention them, but there were so many interesting proposals in Dwayne and Paolo and Michael's sort of suggestion. I will ask each speaker to comment on each other or add, and in addition to answering the 2 questions. One concerns, how can you maintain a multilateral system if you have so many regional trade agreements with obligations that conflict or overlap? I don't see any problem with overlaps. And then the second question that we hear more and more, how can you talk about a multilateral system when today there's so many exceptions to MFN? I would recall, however, that most world trade is between EU, US, and China together and separately, and this is still covered by MFN. But other than that, whether it's the proposal for these new sort of trade remedy chamber of the appellate body, role of the private sector, the rule of law, etc., and taking advantage of disasters to change things, I would like to ask Michael. We have 15 minutes. Michael, can you maybe in 3 minutes or so, because we may have other questions that pop up, can you add, comment on what you heard and give your views on the questions if you want?
Thanks very much, Gabrielle. So first of all, yeah, it's quite a tough ask that you've given me, but let's give it a shot.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. No, hopefully less than that. So I think just picking up on one of the points, and it may not be directly addressing your points. I think you need to remember that 2/3 of our membership are developing countries of different sizes, and if you're thinking of economies of over 1 billion people, China is only one, and so there is, if you're thinking about this, you know, ideas as far as subsidies are concerned, it's not just one member that you need to concern. It's we need to convince, or you need to convince. It's a range of members who look to the Chinese example as a model of development to follow. Now, whether or not that's within the rules or whatever, I'm not going to comment on. A broader perspective, and I think this speaks to the work on natural disasters, Gabrielle, is, do we have a shared kind of understanding of why the trading system exists and what its purpose is and its rules are? We have these defining principles: non-discrimination, MFN, etc. But then what are we aiming for? What are we targeting here? And so this, in a sense, speaks to a little bit to the 2030 agenda, and then some of the threats that we face. So obviously climate change is one. The pandemic, some view as perhaps a first manifestation of that. So then there's this question then about, well, why do these rules exist? What are they there for? Obviously, the settlement of disputes, the conduct of trade between countries, but then what's the higher goal? What are we aiming for? And this comes back to this point about more than 2/3 of the membership being developing countries and their aspirations and fears as well. So there, and this comes back to then perhaps where I finished, which is there seems to be sort of 3 main approaches to looking at this. One is a systemic approach. So if you look at it, put it in the context of the response to the pandemic, this idea through the G20 that we need to keep markets open. We need to stop from protectionist measures. So that's one perspective in terms of the functioning of the system. And a lot of the ideas speak to the functioning of the system. And then the rules. So there, whether it be the rules on subsidies, whether it be the rules on IP, whether it be the rules in trade facilitation, agriculture, etc., etc., etc. And then there's waivers and exceptions. So obviously, regional trade agreements are, well, you can argue whether they're an exception, but you can see that there's going to be perhaps an increasing demand for exceptions from the rules as you start to see the impacts of things like COVID, or whether it be natural disasters, starting to manifest themselves more within the system and having deleterious effects on economic performance. So those were really the main points that I wanted to make.
But Michael, can I ask you, we hear a lot that COVID could be the occasion to rebuild and rebuild better. Do you believe that this is possible?
Anything is possible. I think what tends to happen is that natural disasters, well, if you look at the experience at a national level, they tend to accelerate structural changes. So they manifest those changes within the economy. An obvious area where that's happening is e-commerce. So yes, they can, but it's up to members to be able to grasp the opportunity. I'm not sure that there's, well, I mean, there are proposals obviously to be able to do that. So without wishing to be seen to be favoring any one set of proposals, let me stop there. Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you, Michael. Paolo, do you want to add? You wanted to develop, but you can also answer this question. Is it possible to build better after COVID?
I hope so, because if we build worse or we let it go down, then we will have a problem. 2 points on the questions, which on regional agreements have to be careful, because being now responsible for the Mercosur agreement, about what I say, I think that will become a problem if the multilateral trading system continues drift towards irrelevance. And I totally agree with Eric's point that if we start not only having bilateral agreements, but bilateral agreement that bluntly violates the MFN principle, that is kind of mini deal to fix that or that particular vested interest in our economies, that would be very, very damaging for the system as a whole. On the second point, and I go back to my 2 points on rule of law and level playing field, I totally agree with Dwayne. These are connected. I mean, the reason why the United States have brought to that extreme position in the WTO, the appellate body, is strictly linked to the what was perceived as a lack of level playing field and the lack of market economy driven in certain countries. And I would say that many countries that are not market economy driven. But of course, if you become as important as China is to now, then it becomes a bigger problem. That's the point. We need to address that. I see when I started working in Digitrade, which is much too many years ago to confess, there are things like, the reform of the anti-dumping regulation that we have seen, the idea of screening investments, the idea of limiting the takeover and mergers based on the subsidies, countervailing subsidies in a third country from another member of the WTO, what we call the international procurement instrument, by which we would be going towards a more reciprocal approach to public procurement, the enforcement regulation in case the dispute settlement system, both bilaterally and in the WTO, doesn't work any longer. These are things that when I was young and blonde in the EU were taboo. You wouldn't discuss about that. Now are part of our policy. Why? Because the things are changed, as Dwayne rightly noted. It's not just me who noticed that these are changed. Clearly, there's everybody, and I think people in the US and in China and all over the place are noting this. And they realize that the alternative is either drifting towards a non-rule-based system where might replaces right, as it was said, or we need to go back to the idea of the Uruguay round of two different systems with a different role of the state. I mean, Paris and the Bercy place building in the 1980s were an important decision-making element in the economic decision in the European Union, just to make an example. So the idea that the state has to play always the same role, and this crisis will accelerate that. The discourse that we are following now, or that we're listening now on the role of the state in the economy from international organizations compared to what we were hearing 10 years ago, is different. So nobody has to go in this conversation thinking that they're a believer, that they got the right, and either with us or against us, either you're in or you're out, which was what. But with the idea of finding a new equilibrium. Now, in big places like the EU, the US, and China, which is I quote them just because it's the one you put in the title, you don't do international reform for the sake of it. You do international reform if it fits with your domestic agenda. So we have to hope, and that the politicians in the various places, they realize that the domestic agenda somehow fit with this kind of reforms. I believe it does. I believe that sooner or later we will have to get there. But this alignment of stars doesn't happen all the time, and there's a risk that things go wrong. But we are here as well to make sure that they don't. And to respond to Daniel, clearly the principle of market-oriented and rule of law will have to be there. But again, we need to negotiate the rules. The principles are something. Then we need to negotiate new rules to incarnate those principles.
Thank you, Paolo, for also taking on board Daniel's question on market and non-market economy. A lot of very fundamental questions, the role of state, the role of the private sector raised by Dwayne. And I was just told that we've been given an extra 5 minutes if after the 4 minutes we have, you want to add. Dwayne, yes. What are your views? Is it possible to build better? And you want to add to what you started or respond to the questions?
Both.
Reforming, and I would just add one point, reforming in the WTO, where 2/3 of the members claim that they're different, being developing country, it's a big challenge. And as Michael said, very different size, very different type, very different economies. Please, Dwayne.
Yeah, well, so I'm not sure where to begin. I have a lot of different points I want to make. First of all, when I came to Washington in 1984, you had Congressman Sam Gibbons from Florida, Dan Rostenkowski was chair of House Ways and Means from Illinois. There were people who supported trade. Trade was not a 4-letter word back in 84 in the mid 80s. Since then, it's very hard to find, except in the private sector, it's pretty hard to find anybody in the United States Congress who is, a robust enthusiast of international trade. Look, Trump, the main reason Trump was elected, in my opinion, is because here came this Republican who on trade was more protectionist than Hillary was. And they've been following that policy ever since, and it's got them a long way. You're not going to put the FTA regional trade agreement genie back in the bottle, nor really should you really have to. The multilateral trading system and regional trade agreements can live side by side, in my opinion. And why shouldn't they? What is the purpose of all of this, guys? Let's not get too enamored. Some of us work for the WTO and love the WTO and sign me up for all that stuff. But if it helps people's lives, if it lifts people out of poverty, and I would argue that it's in the national security and foreign policy interests of the United States, the European Union, Japan, and every other developed country for the developing world to improve their lot in life. It doesn't do anybody any good for people in the developing world to be, starving and a sea of disenfranchised people. So I think we set about reforming the WTO, the multilateral trading system. I think you got to deal with the level playing field issue with China. I'm not picking on China. I'm just trying to deal with reality and help put forward constructive solutions. Look, you cannot ask a guy who has a small steel company or pipe and tube company in Illinois, and all of his family's assets are wrapped up in this business, and say, listen, you know, we got to allow imports in here and you'll get export markets. And he says, well, wait a minute. I'm competing against the government of China. I can't win that battle. So you have to address that. Another quick thing, and I know I'm jumping around. Think about the WTO dispute settlement, and you know this well, Gabrielle. When we first were working on this, you know, disputes back under the GATT and then early days of the WTO, cases were more or less, you know, let's call them simple. Well, can you imagine when we're dead and gone, if we still have a dispute settlement system? There'll be disputes over, I don't know, technical regulations for DNA coding. I'm not smart enough to even know what. So I mean, we better get this system reformed and look in the future. And we got to have page limits. We got to have. Russia cannot. God bless. We represent Russia. They cannot give a 2-hour or whatever it was, a 3-hour opening statement in the EU energy package case. So we better set about this. And the reason I know it may sound naive to have a lawyers committee. Here's what I'm thinking. You've got 2/3 of the membership's a developing country. You've got rivalries between, I mean, even the EU and the United States, certainly, but of course, China. Well, if you came forward with a comprehensive package, it'd be a great start to a discussion by the membership. They can see the trade-off over here versus the gain over there. And I think if you had the right lawyers in the room, my last point, if you had the right lawyers.
No, but I have a question for you on this, because I thought your proposal for a comprehensive set of reforms suggested by the private sector was great. And we have another 4 minutes. And as the sponsor, I'll give it to you. How can you make this happen? This comprehensive set of reforms put forward by the private sector. And why is it that it has not happened?
Well, maybe other people know why it hasn't happened, but the way you do it, you don't sit around waiting for permission. If you have somebody who pays for a lawyer's committee, and I know it's, you know, but come on, somebody's got the money. I don't know if it's the Gates Foundation or somebody, but you get the right people in the room who don't park their egos at the door and who have no agenda except to reform the WTO and address issues and take China's interests into account. You cannot ignore them. Probably have Chinese lawyers in the room, but if you approach this in the right way, you could pump out and produce in about a year's time reform of the TBT agreement, DS, China, some proposals that people could start to talk about, because it's got to be comprehensive.
I count on you. You have to do it before you retire.
Yeah, right. No, I know I can think of numerous people who, if you got them in the room and they approach this in good faith and are not just looking out for their country or their interests, but looking out for the WTO and the multilateral trading system, I believe this could be done.
I count on you, Dwayne.
All right.
Unless Paolo or Michael really needs to ask a question, because we have 1 minute and 30, or make a comment. Paolo, did you want to add something? Paolo, did you want to add something?
Yes.
You have a minute. I thought Dwayne was going to give us the perfect miracle solution to this enormous problem.
No, I don't have the miracle solution, either, as you know. But one element that will be very important in all of this conversation is trust, and it's something that's been painfully
Dwayne
missing.
alluded to that as well.
Yes. So because I don't know why, but there was a lot of, I could see 1,000 ways, no, 1,000 no, but there are ways to sort out the appellate body. There are ways to sort out the level playing field. But of course, you need to get there with some degree of trust. I think that was missing, and is something that is missing as well on the debate on special and differential treatment, which we hope in the EU, as I say, to make some proposals as well in the future, and that would be an important part of the agenda. And the fishery subsidies negotiation, which need to be sorted out, otherwise really the credibility of the system becomes very shaky. We'll have to give an answer to this, and that will require how can I say, that will require authority and a long sight vision from both big emerging developing countries and developed countries, because we can afford to fail on that.
Thank you.
Also, a quick
yes,
point.
Go ahead, Dwayne.
Well, just a quick little point that I meant to, it's kind of, but look at all the regional trade agreements, those who think, you know, none of those have with the I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but except for maybe the North American, now the USMCA, there's very few, if any, regional trade agreements that have an effective dispute settlement system. So the WTO, if nothing else, the WTO dispute settlement system is an important tool in the toolbox of trade liberalization and bringing the world along for the benefit of everybody, especially those people in the developing world.
So we can really not make a mistake. We have to make this reform work. And the list is long, and I really think this comprehensive set presented could allow for each members, different they are, to find their way out. But we have to find a solution. So thank you to Julinda, to BIICL, to all the speakers. Of course, it was very entertaining. And we meet soon in person. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this terrific panel. The next session, the next panel will convene at 3:30.
Thank you, Michael, Paolo, and Dwayne.
Thank you.
Ciao, Gabriele. Thanks a lot.